Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pastana. And we're here today with special guest, MaryCatherine McDonald, who's here to share with us her new book, Unbroken. The Trauma Response is Never Wrong, and the Other Things You Need to Know to Take Back Your Life. So welcome to the show, MaryCatherine McDonald.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Oh my goodness, what an honor it is to have you here and to talk about this book. What inspired you to write this?
I've been in the field. So my background is in the academic world. I'm a professor and also a coach. And I've been researching trauma since 2009 from an interdisciplinary perspective. So I bring in neuroscience with psychology and also the critical perspective of philosophy. And I've been studying trauma, and there's so much in the field that is still being debated when it comes to the basics. What kinds of events count as trauma and what do not, and things like that. And there's so much interesting misunderstanding. I think we've inherited a lot of bad old science and beliefs that have been really corrosive to the way that we understand the trauma response. So I wrote the book to get this idea out to everyone, however many people that I could, that this idea that we are broken if we are experiencing trauma symptoms is actually scientifically false. The trauma response is a strength response. And of course, when the trauma response goes haywire and causes distress and symptoms, that's something that we need to work on. But when we start with the understanding that the response is a strength response that comes from our natural tendency to adapt, then we can peel away the shame at having the symptoms and go from there.
My goodness, that's such a big deal because that shame and all that stigma really, I think, keeps a lot of people back.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's just horrible.
Yeah.
Are there other myths that go around as well with this?
There's so many. I think that some of them come from when we started studying trauma in the 1800s, and we didn't have the technology to look at the brain or really understand what was going on in the system, in the nervous system. But some of them come from just the societal narratives. I think one of the myths is that we arrive at healing when we stop feeling anything about something. And that's actually not how our brain works at all. So to expect that, if you have a big loss or you have a trauma, that you'll get to this arrival point where you no longer feel anything when you think about it is you're setting yourself up for failure. So there's that. And I think there's some other misconceptions that float around about triggers, because this has become something that, everyone kind of wants to talk about and engage with, but we are sort of twisting the word to mean a lot of different things when it is supposed to mean something very specific, which is when you have a memory that triggers an instance of reliving rather than remembering. And when those come up, that's a sign to your system that something needs to be integrated. It's not a sign that there's something wrong with you. It's a sign that there's some work to be done. But I think we're getting the narrative around triggers wrong in a couple different ways. So I think there's a lot around trauma that gets misunderstood. And the book is sort of broken into, the first thing that I ask you to do in the book is to kind of forget everything that you think you know about trauma. Let's start over and get on the same page. And then each chapter kind of takes on a different set of misconceptions, incorrect things, just kind of updating the science and things like that.
Well, thank goodness for that. So, to start from the basics, what really is trauma?
That is a great question. I was really shocked when I jumped into this field in 2009 to find out, because we've been studying trauma since the late 1800s in an academic setting. And so I was really shocked to find out that there's still a lot of debate amongst clinicians about what things count as trauma. The definition that I like to use is separate from the type of event and more situates what is traumatic with the person who's going through it. And I can explain why in a second. But the definition that I use is you have a potential traumatic event when you have two things happen: an unbearable emotional experience, and then that lacks a relational home. So when you have an unbearable emotional experience that lacks a relational home, you have the potential for something to become lasting trauma. If you don't get that relational home and you have to just sit with those overwhelming emotions, which your system can't really metabolize, what is potentially traumatic is much more likely to become lasting trauma. And a relational home is just a place where you can sit with someone or a group of people or several people at different times and be helped through the overwhelm.
So when we look at that, and my goodness, it sounds like getting to this place where we can work through that overwhelm is such a big deal.
Yeah, it's a huge deal. I think that some of the research that I've done in the academic world has really highlighted the impact of a relational home. So, for example, when combat soldiers come home, it's not so much what they've been through in deployment, it's whether they have a safe landing spot when they get home. And that is what is much more likely to determine whether someone is going to have PTSD or not. And so I think the hope there, the hopeful piece is that if we can all get on the same page societally and we can understand what it means to provide a relational home for one another, then when we are struggling or when the people around us are struggling, they're much more likely to get the help that they need. I think there's this other misconception that the only place you can speak about trauma and or get any healing is in a room with a therapist. And of course, there is a time and a space for therapy and the therapeutic relationship. And we also heal in relationship with one another,
The subtitle of your book is The Trauma Response is Never Wrong. What does that mean?
So I want to kind of distinguish or differentiate between the trauma response and trauma symptoms. So the trauma response is this amazing, beautiful set of default responses that we have evolved to have, where when your system detects enough overwhelm and threat, it has basically an alarm system and a set of processes that will make it more likely for you to survive that threat. And so that's the trauma response. And I think, we have carried through history this idea that to be traumatized is to be weak, that there are some people that go through traumatic events and come through unscathed. And that's just not true at all. What's much more true is that we have this biology, these default systems in place that are adaptive. And that is a miracle. That's amazing. They take us out when we get to peak overwhelm because they're trying to help us survive. So that's the trauma response. And that's, when people talk about the stress response system, that's what they're talking about is the trauma response. Because stress and trauma are very closely related. Trauma symptoms are the result of when we get sort of flipped into the trauma response and can't get out, or we get flipped into the trauma response in a moment that is safe or benign. And that is what we want to work with when you're someone who has had trauma that has become lasting trauma. And I don't ever want to say that those things don't cause distress. Of course they do. Those are the symptoms that we want to work with. But when we understand the response at the core of trauma and that it is adaptive, and we understand a little bit about how it works, then we can intervene without shame on the nervous system when those symptoms kind of come up.
So when someone is experiencing like a trauma response or have gone through trauma, is it just an indication that they're more resilient?
Resilience is a really interesting thing, and it's something that a lot of folks are talking about right now. And we're not exactly sure 100% what makes someone resilient, what resilience even is. And there are 100 different layers that are part of your neurobiology and part of your lived experience that determine whether you're resilient at one time or another. This is actually one of the reasons why it's so problematic to define trauma by the kinds of events that you go through. Because, for example, you, Marianne, might have an event happen right now that you're totally capable of handling. You know how to resource yourself. You know how to get a relational home to help with the overwhelm. But if that had happened 5 years ago, that might have become lasting trauma. And so to say that you're more or less resilient is sort of like a moving target. And there's a lot of stuff that comes up with resilience that's actually biological. So certain people have glucocorticoid steroid receptors in their brain that are more sensitive, or they have more of those, which makes them more sensitized to stress or less sensitized to stress, right? So I hesitate to kind of say that if you've been through more, then you're more resilient, because it really depends on the person and their biology. And also, like, sort of the context of their life. What does their support system look like? How many people are there for them when they're struggling? In what ways are they there for them? Things like that.
Thank you for going over that, because resilience is kind of a hot topic right now. So
It
you hear
totally
about
is.
that quite a bit.
Yeah.
Well, and so what should we know about repairing our trauma? Because there seems to be, you have this beautiful pattern kind of laid out on some things that we can look for.
Yes. So I think the best way to do this is to talk about the difference between normal memories and the way they get coded, and then trauma memories and the way they get coded. So the way that our psychology is structured, we file things away in this really complicated, amazing filing system in our brain. And the reason for that is because if we have everything really organized, all of our experiences, we're much more likely to survive, right? It's helpful to know and remember this mushroom is poisonous and this one is something I can eat for dinner, things like that. So that's just how we are wired. And when we have, normal events happening, within about 24 hours of an event, you get a file folder in your brain. And that file has a narrative, it has emotional content, and it has, like a set of meaning tags that help your brain find it when it needs it. And so when you have an overwhelming event, the trauma response kicks off, and 47 different parts of your brain and body and general biology alter function to help you prepare to handle that threat. One of the things that goes partially offline is that file system, that file room kind of, the lights go out and nobody's back there filing things away. And so again, within, about 24 hours of a traumatic event, a significantly overwhelming event, you have a file folder created, but it's a disorganized one. And your brain doesn't like that, because a disorganized file might be dangerous, and that might be something that threatens you. And so every time you have something in your perception that comes through and reminds someone in the file room of that, disorganized file, it will toss it to the front of your mind to give you the opportunity to organize it again. The problem is that your alarm system also recognizes those pieces as danger. And so there's one part of your mind that's trying to help you organize, and then there's another part of your mind that's trying to protect you in the moment. And those two pieces are sort of in conflict at that time. And so what that creates is these situations where you have a very outsized response to a basically neutral stimulus. So just for a silly example, let's say you're sitting at work and someone walks by and they're wearing a maroon shirt, and you start to feel really anxious, and you don't even know that it's because of the maroon shirt. You're just sitting at work trying to have your normal day and you're feeling anxious. Well, it turns out that what you had been mugged at one point a couple of years ago, and the person who mugged you was wearing that same exact maroon color shirt. Your brain is trying to get you to organize that data. What does maroon mean, and how and in what ways is it dangerous? But your brain is off to the races before you get a chance to do that organization. And so you start having this response. So to go back to your question of how can we sort of work with this, the best starting point, absolute square one, is to understand that your body is a barometer and it's giving you important data all the time. I think in our society now, we are very used to being totally disconnected from our body. We try to manage our bodily systems and functions instead of letting them talk to us. But if you can keep a log of when you start to feel distress, you can start to notice patterns. Your body will tell you what needs to be processed and worked with. And then depending on the severity of the event, there's a lot of different ways that you can work with that. You can work with that memory with a therapist, and they can help you sort of organize the narrative and the emotional content so that you can, so your brain can start recognizing that file in a more coherent, less upsetting way. And there's also things you can do to regulate your nervous system so that when you have an outsized response, you can get some relief in that moment. And that's, I think, a big place that we are really missing the conversation. And that's not something that most therapists do, is to give you tools to kind of master your nervous system. And so when I wrote the book, I wanted to make sure that the reader had a toolbox of different tools. So there's one or two tools at the end of every chapter that are aimed at helping you regulate your nervous system and deal with these responses as they're happening in real time.
Okay, there's so much there I want to unpack. You know?
I may have had too much coffee this morning.
I know. Hey, I'm glad that you are spending the time and going through this with us because there's a lot here, and I found your book to be just so powerful.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and one of the things I was thinking about, I've heard people talk about, well, they don't really have memories of their childhood. It was so
Mhm.
abusive or so bad. How do people work through that?
That's a great question. There's this myth, and I so get it. I've had this experience too. I think it's maybe just a natural tendency when we feel like there's a black hole or there's an abyss in the past, we have this incredible urge to go and figure out exactly what it is. And we're telling kind of too simple a story when we do this, and we're saying, "Oh, something awful must have happened to me that I blocked out." Um, and I need to go back in order to heal. I need to go back and figure out exactly what that is and live through it again and sort of, feel through it. That's actually not necessary. The amazing thing about what your body does is that it tells you what you need to work on in the moment right now. And so when there's something that needs to come up, your body will tell you that in the form of some distressing symptom. And I know that it's, I'm saying it's a miracle, and I don't mean to minimize the pain that comes up with the symptom, but the symptom is telling you something that needs to be worked on. And the amazing thing is that you can work on that. You can get healing without having to go back to the original source of the trauma. The reason that I say that is because it can be re-traumatizing in an unnecessary way to try to go back. And it also is sometimes impossible. And that can be either because the part of your brain that stores long-term memory isn't developed yet when the upsetting things happened or when the overwhelming things happened. Or it could be because of injury. We have lots of case studies in psychology of people who have brain injury that prevents them from accessing their long-term memory. And they still are able to heal from the symptoms present forward, if that makes sense.
In some ways, it sounds like that could be kind of a gift, not being able to
Yeah.
really have that if something traumatic has happened. And I guess we can kind of look back on family experience or experiences and kind of go, okay, well, maybe something did, maybe something didn't. But you're saying that we should really look at what we're feeling and then work
Yes.
on that.
Yep. And I can give you kind of like a small example because I know this can seem kind of vague and strange. If you had, let's say you had a trauma when you were younger where you felt trapped and sort of terrified by a parent. And it happened, maybe a bunch of times, maybe only one time, but you don't have access to the memories. What's going to happen is that you will feel trapped in your present as an adult in situations where you cognitively know you're not trapped, right? So let's say you're at work and you have a coworker who kind of reminds you in some unconscious way of your parent. You might start feeling really anxious and trapped at your desk. And you might be thinking like, this is why it's so important to peel away the shame, because we go right to it. We say, oh my God, what's wrong with me? Why am I having these symptoms? I know that this person is safe. I know that I'm safe at work. What's wrong with me? That's always where we go. But what's happening is that your system is trying to tell you that you need an experience of freedom to counter the feeling of being trapped. And so if you can actually work with that in that moment. So you have a coworker that feels unsafe to you. If you can give yourself the opportunity to feel free from them, and that can happen in a tiny little way. You can just, walk away or leave the office or take a walk around the block every time you find them to be triggering. That will slowly over time recalibrate your nervous system to show you that you are actually in charge. And so the threat system can kind of take a back seat because it knows that you sort of have it.
Thank you for taking the time to go through that.
Yeah.
And what if we see like reoccurring patterns in our trauma? Then what does that tell us about ourselves?
It's such a great question. It's so humbling. If you're in that space, again, this is a place where we go to shame immediately. And I think we need to really pause there because shame is such a barrier to healing. It's like trying to climb a mountain with a car strapped to your ankle and then being like, I don't know why, usually I hike every day. I don't understand why I can't hike today. So when you have a repeating pattern, what's happening is that there's something in the trauma that hasn't been processed. And so it's coming up again because there's still something to kind of work on. We have to be really careful of the language that we use when we talk about repetition, because it can start to sound like we're doing it to ourselves. And that is not at all the case. These dynamics are very sticky and tricky, and they come up not because we want them, but because there's something in us that either doesn't see them or they feel like home. There's a million different reasons that we might be repeating something. The most kind of common way this happens is in romantic relationships, right? So let's say there's something in your childhood, you had some family dynamic where you felt really neglected. And then in every romantic relationship you find yourself in as an adult, you find yourself in a dynamic where you're neglected. It's very easy to tell a story about that that's too simple, that says, oh, well, I'm causing this clearly. But I think what's much more nuanced to say is that there's something from that experience from childhood that still needs to be worked on and healed. And the great irony of trauma is that we are often, most often, traumatized in relationship, and we are most often healed in relationship. So if we can start by peeling away the shame and look at what is happening in the pattern and why it might be happening, then we can unwind it and give ourselves the opposite experience.
My goodness, that sounds just such a great way to approach things, especially, I mean, you talk about relationships. If you often hear people say, well, I've been dating the same guy and I have the same results, and I would, I know a few people have done that and they feel really bad about it.
Yeah. It's really humbling. And it's also like, you don't want to be in that relationship, of course. And so to find yourself there again, you're like, oh my God, I haven't learned. And we immediately start beating ourselves up instead of saying, hold on, is there a worthiness piece here? Is there some discomfort in accepting love that is actually more healthy because I haven't been shown that? And so that feels uncomfortable to my system. We need to learn how to look at the stuff with curiosity instead of judgment.
And so that shame piece is something that really stands out for a lot of people.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that it's not helped by the fact that we are always looking for a quick fix on something that is most likely a lifelong path. And that's true of grief as well. We're given these tiny little windows, like 2 weeks, and then you're expected to kind of be over it and on with your life. And that's just not true. And it's the same thing with healing from trauma, and also just getting to know ourselves as humans, right? That we are complicated, fascinating individuals, and we all contain multitudes, as Whitman would say, and learning about ourselves and what we need is a lifelong process. And I think if we can start there and accept that, then it becomes actually kind of an exciting opportunity to get to know yourself rather than it being humbling. I find as I have moved through, working with clients and writing and doing this academically, I've been able to come to acceptance more with myself. And so when something comes up again, it's almost like I sort of chuckle at it because I'm like, oh, okay, didn't fully learn that lesson. Here we are. And when I do that, then I can kind of approach it in a more kind way, which makes the process a lot less full of suffering.
I was just going to ask, what's an approach that we should start taking with shame to kind of dismantle that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, shame is there for a reason. I think that we need to understand that we are never going to fully get rid of shame, but we don't have to let it drive the car and determine all of our behavior either. There's a middle way. And I think the middle way involves understanding that one of the reasons that shame is there is because it's trying to protect you. And it's trying to keep you small, because if you think about it from like an evolutionary biology perspective, when you did something, let's say you lived in a tiny little village and there was only 4 people there and you really relied on each other for survival. If you did something that was so shameful that you got ostracized, you would immediately be in physical mortal danger. And so the imprint of shame on our biology is really strong because it's trying to protect us. We don't want to be ostracized because that's dangerous. And we live in a very different world now, and we can do many more things, solo. But that biological imprint remains. And when we can understand that, I think we can start to relate to shame differently. So we can sort of step back from it and say, okay, shame, I hear you. You're trying to tell me that I've made a misstep. Here's what I'm going to do about that misstep, right? I'm going to, let's say it's something social. I'm going to apologize. I'm going to commit to being different in the future. And then we can stop worrying about this. And when you sort of can talk to and relate to the shame in that way, it stops feeling like it needs to be in charge because you're not paying attention.
And I think that's such a great exercise to do it that way, to approach it like, okay, here it is. I see it. This is what I'm going to do to change it. And let's move on.
Yeah. And you can also turn to it and say, listen, like, I know you're trying to help, but you're wrong. Like these symptoms come from my biology and, they make sense.
That's awesome. Being able, and I mean, my goodness, you have so many tools within your book that we can use to heal. And I just found them to be so impactful. What is one that you could share with us right now?
Oh, there's so many. One of my favorite ones that I love that I've adapted from positive psychology is this exercise called absurd hope. One of the things that folks with trauma have in common, and I say this, also speaking from my own experience as well, is a real difficulty believing in, trusting, and having hope for the future. And that is not a way that we need to live. There's a quote, David Morris is a writer who wrote a really beautiful book called The Evil Hours, which is about his experience with prolonged exposure therapy as a combat veteran and PTSD. And he said that trauma is a truth that tells you a lie. And I love that sentence because it does so much work. It says so much. But the general idea is that, your traumatic experience is trying to trick you. It's true that what trauma shows us is that we are vulnerable in ways that we can't get rid of. That's the truth. The lie is that the only way to live is by being hypervigilant, by not having hope, by feeling incapable of love, all of these things. And so in positive psychology, they've done a lot of work and shown that if you can lean into hope and imagination for your future, that helps an enormous amount with the symptoms of PTSD, of anxiety, and of depression. But I found when I was working with my clients that hoping for their future was too big of an ask. When you're dealing with PTSD, when you're dealing with trauma, it's sort of a ridiculous thing to have somebody try to turn to their own future and hope, because when they look into the future, there's just an abyss. And it feels like this absurd luxury to try to, just imagine my future. Okay, I'm trying to get through this moment, And so the exercise that I kind of adapted and made up was this one where you, instead of hoping for your future, you lean into absurdity and you let yourself for 5 to 15 minutes a day, you let yourself imagine a future that you know to be impossible. And the reason that this is helpful and important is because of brain circuitry. When you imagine, when you have hope for the future, you are leaning into the brain circuit that we can call the hope circuit, which is a bunch of brain structures kind of tied together that help you imagine something in the future. And the hope circuit, the cool thing about this is that when the hope circuit is online and you've got a bunch of energy and blood flow in that circuit, the fear circuit necessarily shuts down because those two circuits are counterposed. They can't be on at the same time. So that's why positive psychology was so excited about having you look at your future. But if you can't look at your future, you can still work in the hope circuit by imagining a future that you know to be impossible. So what does that look like? I'm 40 years old. I do not have a future as a ballerina. I also happen to have celiac disease, so I can't eat gluten. So one of my absurd hopes might be that I am, an award-winning ballerina and I live in Paris. And every morning I come down out of my beautiful apartment that has all these skylights and I grab a baguette on the way to the studio and I dance all day. And I have fabulous friends and we go out to dinner afterwards and I don't have to worry about anything that I'm eating, right? Like this is absurd. It's not going to happen. I can't become a ballerina at 40, nor can I eat gluten. But by imagining that in great detail, I'm turning on the hope circuit and that turns off the fear circuit. And if you do that for a period of time, 5 to 7 days is a great start. If you can do that every single day, you start to have access to real hope. and your future starts to actually sort of populate, and you start to notice like really silly patterns. So maybe you really love dancing and you are not going to become a ballerina, but maybe you take a dance class. And so you're in one of the things that's so devastating about trauma is that over time, it tries to make your life very, very small. And this is a way to kind of make your life a little bit more expansive. So that's my favorite exercise in the book. And there are lots more, but I love that one.
I can see why that's such a great one. And, I think that would start to kind of bridge the opportunity for hope when people start doing that, regardless how ridiculous it is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I've worked with clients who are really, really resistant. And then they say, I have no imagination and I can't do this. And we start building them together. And they're, as soon as you start, they're laughing and we're adding details. And the more you practice this, even if it's difficult in the beginning, you're actually rewiring your brain. So it might sound like a really silly exercise, but it's really powerful. And I just kind of want to nip this in the bud for any listeners who might be having this question. I've been getting a lot of questions when I talk about this, about, okay, isn't this just kind of maladaptive daydreaming? And what if I'm doing this 16 hours a day? And I think it's important to understand that any tool can become a weapon. It depends on how you use it, right? And so if you're using any of these tools for 16 hours a day, at the detriment of your work and your relationships and all the other things in your life that have the potential to give you joy, of course, that's something that we want to look at. And maybe that's not the tool for you at the moment. But if you're able to do it in these more controlled ways, intentional ways, then you are choosing the tool and you're using it in the right way rather than having it be compulsive.
Oh, that just opened up a bunch of questions for me. Okay, so I think I'll start with the easier one. And maybe this isn't as easy, but how does trauma impact our view of the world?
Oh, that's a great question. I think the phrase that I love to use when it comes to this is that there are certain experiences that stamp our world with meaning. And sometimes those are good and beautiful experiences. If you think about, the highlight reel of your life, you might have some moments that really made you believe in humanity, moments that made you believe in love, things like that. And then there are counters that also stamp your world with meaning, which are these more overwhelming or traumatic moments. I don't think they're necessarily always traumatic. They can just be, negative. But when you have trauma, certainly when you have PTSD, one of the things that happens to your worldview is that it becomes kind of impossible to trust. And that may start off as, well, okay, I was abused, and so I have difficulty trusting people in romantic relationships. But it won't stop there. Usually what happens is that it then grows, it sort of metastasizes like a cancer. All of a sudden, you also can't trust your coworkers who you used to feel really comfortable with. And now you can't trust your family. And you can't really trust any institutions, and you can't really trust anything in the world, and the experts are getting it wrong. And all of a sudden it's like, you can't trust anything and anyone. And so your world becomes stamped with meaning that then sometimes sort of spreads. And that's a great thing to sort of notice. I think that, we're kind of coming out of a global trauma right now. And I don't think we've even begun to process what has happened over the last couple of years. And I think I see this a lot, people having really diminished faith in other people at large, in the world at large. And if that's you and that's not characteristic of you, that's a great sign that there's some trauma there to be integrated and worked with.
One thing I want to talk about is self-regulation. So if we're dealing with someone that has issues with self-regulation, how does that tie into all of this?
Yeah. So this is tricky. I think that there's often sort of a dance that we do. One example might be if you have a coworker who's really dysregulated, and what that looks like is an emotional outburst and abusive work behavior. And they're not recognizing that they're having a trauma response. They're not even wanting to take any kind of accountability there. I mean, I think that it depends on the situation and it depends on your relationship to the person. But what is very likely to happen is that your own stuff is going to start getting triggered, right? Because that's upsetting and activating, even if you feel like you don't have any trauma in your past. And so I think that the best thing to do there is to try to point out to the person, if it's safe to do so, that you feel like the response that they're having to the situation doesn't match the situation. And so I like the word outsized, but it's really hard to talk about this stuff without sounding judgmental. And I'm always so careful, or try to be so careful about language. And so one thing that you might say is approach the coworker in a time of calm. So not in the middle of the conflict and not directly after, and say, it seems like you had a response there in that meeting that doesn't really fit the intensity of what was going on. We were talking about strategy, and all of a sudden it became, really heated. Are you aware of that? What does that feel like to you in your body? And hopefully, if there's enough trust, that person will say, now that you mention it, I did get really heated. I started to feel flushed in my face. And I now that you mention it, I kind of felt attacked, and I don't really know where that came from. And now all of a sudden you have some stuff you can work with, and navigate around. When I do work with couples, a lot of what we do is look at how people have conflict and what comes up and what buttons are we accidentally pushing without knowing it. Because what happens is there's like these invisible buttons that we push in our partners that create these explosive responses that don't make sense to us because we don't see that we've just pushed a button. And so if we can both have awareness about where the buttons are, how they got installed, and what the protocol is to bring someone back to baseline when they do get activated to that level, then all of a sudden conflict can start to look totally different. And so the other piece of that, with whether it's a coworker or a friend, or a partner, learning how to bring yourself back to baseline is really critical. Some people need a 20-minute break and fresh air. Some people need physical contact, a hug. Some people need to be distracted, right? But I think a lot of what I do in the book is try to empower people to understand what their responses look like, because we all have unique ones, because they develop in our lives, given our biology and our experience, and become empowered to understand how to get yourself back to a place where you have all of the access to the brain, circuitry that you need.
It sounds like it also offers a great deal of not only knowledge, but compassion for people who are going through an issue of self-regulation, and we're able to see it for kind of what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have a tendency to look at the behavior and not what caused the behavior. And, this is tricky territory. If it's an abusive situation, abuse is obviously never okay. And I don't want to be, sound like I'm trying to use compassion there. That being said, I think when someone is having an outsized response, it's really important, because what's happening is that there's something going on that's dysregulating their symptoms or their system and causing these symptoms that we can intervene on, which means the behavior can change, assuming that they're willing to change it.
Now, I know you touched on this a little bit earlier, but how our brain really identifies and handles grief. Mm-hmm. I'd love for you to kind of expand on that.
Oh yeah, it's grief is beautiful and fascinating, and it's a big part of my own story. When I did my master's degree in philosophy and psychoanalysis, and I was actually studying grief and Freud and some contemporary thinkers when my parents both suddenly died, and so I got to live grief while I was studying grief academically, which I think, probably saved my life. So a lot of my origin story, a lot of my trauma is about traumatic loss. And I go into that a little bit in the book. One of the things from a neurobiological perspective that's really important to understand is that when you lose someone, your brain has to remap itself. And so when you have a relationship with someone, you have them in your brain chemistry. You have them in your wiring. You've imagined a future that they will be part of. And when you encounter those moments in the future that they are not there, you grieve all over again. And so I think if we can, there's so much work to be done when it comes to grief, because I think we live in a grief-phobic society. So we have to start there. Grief and loss is something that's going to affect every single one of us. And we ought to get better at handling it with each other. It would help us all. So there's that piece, but then there's also the compassion for how difficult a brain problem it is to lose someone. Your brain maps the world and all your relationships, again, for efficiency and function. And so when you lose someone, your brain has to remap. And I think when we can understand that that's what's happening, we can give ourselves a little bit more grace when it comes to the grieving process and how long it is.
And is it advisable just to allow people to continue their grieving process? Or, how should someone navigate that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, when you're sent down a grief path, you are sort of committed to a path that you didn't choose, and that is really difficult. And so getting your head around that you're there is kind of step one or ground zero there. I think the other piece is that recognizing, and I'm trying to be careful with my language here because I don't mean this to sound hopeless. I think it's actually the opposite. The grieving process is never over. We use language in our society, which again is a grief phobic society. So this is why we use and keep this language. We use language about getting over it. When I get over it, I'll be able to feel happy again. When I get over it, I'll be able to concentrate. When I get over it, I'll be able to have another relationship, all this kind of stuff. There is no getting over. There is only integrating. We change the relationship that we have with our grief and with the loss changes radically over the years. But it doesn't ever go away. And I don't know, I think that's, again, like, I mean that to be hopeful. I know it might sound damning if there's a listener who's just had a loss, but I think the hope or the promise in that is that you never have to lose the relationship with the person. Like, if we take that thought experiment out and we say, what would it look like to actually get over something? What would that mean? That you don't remember them anymore, that you don't feel that like beautiful pang when you see something that reminds you of them? That's it's just not realistic. So I think understanding that these waves will come always for the rest of your days enables you to relate to the wave differently, to recognize it as a wave, to understand that it's not going to take you out, that it never could, and that it's there to remind you of something. And sometimes that's something beautiful. This morning, it's funny that we're talking about grief. My mom had this very, very intense evening ritual, and she used witch hazel on her face. And I have a cut, so I pulled some witch hazel out this morning to, disinfect it. And the smell of witch hazel, my mom has been dead since 2008, but the smell of the witch hazel brought instant tears to my eyes and this flood of memories of standing in my mom's bedroom, talking to her while she was doing these, evening rituals. And I am at the place in my grief now after so many years where I'm super grateful for that wave, even though it brought tears to my eyes and is bringing tears to my eyes even right now as I'm talking about it. That's what our memories are supposed to do. They're supposed to contain emotional content. If I have this wave hit me and I can welcome it, then the wave feels a lot different.
I know exactly what you're talking about. And I'm so sorry for your loss. Losing a parent is never easy. So
thank you. Yeah, it was certainly a life-changing experience.
I know a lot of our listeners are going through that same thing. I've gone through that as well. And I think when you talk about how grief takes its time and it's going to be with us always, I find that to be very comforting because it tells me that, when I do have these moments of grief, it's not something abnormal. It's something that will, be with me for a while, but it will, basically get to a point where it's changing.
Yes, absolutely. I don't even know what it would mean if we could do it all at once. I've thought of it often as kind of a merciful thing that we can't do it all at once. I remember being shocked in the early days after my dad died, about like, oh, there's moments where we're laughing. Like that's ridiculous. We're supposed to be grieving. You have to grieve the whole time until the grief is over. And it's like, no, you grieve a little bit as your body can take it. And then you laugh. And then you do some other things, and then you grieve a little bit more, and you start to move on, and then you feel guilty about that, and so you grieve. Like it's this merciful process.
I know there are lots of silly and funny and quirky things that we can all remember about a past loved one.
Yes,
and go, gosh, okay, that was funny as all get out.
Absolutely, and what a beautiful thing to be able to laugh in such a. I mean, that's a miracle in such a dark moment.
Well, in your book, you talk about You really kind of share about grounding. And I'd
Mhm.
love for you to share that with us and why that practice is so important.
Yeah, so grounding goes back to this idea that we can regulate our nervous systems. So we can't do anything about the default structures that we come with. We have the trauma response, it's there for a reason. It is designed to sort of adapt and sort of take us out in moments of extreme stress. We can't do anything about that, and nor would we want to. It's like when if you have a smoke alarm in your house that goes off when the steam from the shower comes out of the shower door, or when you're cooking bacon, the answer isn't to throw away all of the smoke alarms, right? You need to recalibrate. And we can recalibrate our nervous systems by regulating those responses when they happen and they're not supposed to. And so if I'm sitting in the office and I'm having a conversation with a coworker that gets a little bit heated and I'm reminded of something from my childhood and I start to get really activated. Number one, if I am tuned into the barometer that my body is, I can see that that's happening, right? Oh, I'm getting activated. I'm feeling anxious. That's really important. And if I can have a set of grounding tools that will help me deal with that anxiety, that then means I can restore myself back to baseline and continue on with the day, basically as normal, within a couple of minutes. And there are two main methods of grounding, and then a million different exercises that fall under each category. The first is top-down regulation, which is when you use your brain circuitry and blood flow in your brain to send a signal to the alarm system that it's actually a false alarm. One of the best grounding tools that's very well studied, believe it or not, is Tetris, the phone game, because Tetris makes a continuous bid on your prefrontal cortex. If you've never played Tetris, it's one of those puzzle games that like these little blocks fall down and you have to line them up. And the better you are, the faster the game gets. You really have to concentrate in order to keep playing. And so within 20 to 40 minutes, and they've done studies and kind of watched people's brains as they do this, because you're manually pushing blood flow and electrical activity into the prefrontal cortex and away from the fear center, over 20 to 40 minutes, your system gets the signal that the alarm was false and it can kind of chill and calm down. There's 100 other things you can do that are top-down process or top-down regulation. And then the other way is bottom-up regulation, which is when you use your body to do the very same thing, to send a signal to the system that the alarm doesn't need to be going off right now. It's a false alarm. And one of the best methods to do bottom-up regulation is breathing into your diaphragm. We have this really neat set of switches in our nervous system that are responsible for turning on the rest and digest response. This is called the parasympathetic nervous system. So it's responsible for keeping you calm, down regulating everything in your system. And if you take a couple of really deep breaths and push against your diaphragm, you hit some of the switches that turn on the rest and digest response and therefore turn off the alarm system. So diaphragmatic breathing is a way that you can do that. There's also a lot of other bottom-up regulation techniques, but I love it when clients have a toolbox. I have a whole toolbox of different tools that I use in different moments of overwhelm to help bring me back down to baseline. And those are the two general kind of buckets.
Thank you for going over that. I felt that was really, really impactful and very important for us to hear. So, what is the history of trauma?
So the history of the study of trauma is really interesting because we've been looking at trauma since the 1800s. And since we didn't have the technology or the knowledge yet to look at the nervous system, we didn't really know what was going on. And so we've called trauma many different things. And it also has this tendency to peak and then absolutely disappear. So we'll have a moment where sort of everyone is talking about trauma. Everyone is looking at trauma. It's seen as legitimate and real, and it's very urgent. And then all of a sudden it becomes taboo and nobody's talking about it anymore. And it's maybe not real. And it's kind of career suicide to look at it if you're in the field. And so I think we're in a peak right now because we are talking about mental illness much more frequently than we used to. There's a lot more openness about trauma and people having a diagnosis, not feeling like they have to hide that, which is amazing. But I worry that we're on the edge of another dip. And I get really nervous about that because if you look at the history of the study of trauma, there was a moment when we did think that trauma was caused by a physical injury. And this is when we called PTSD shell shock. And this is when soldiers had a set of symptoms after they came home from war and nobody could figure out what they were. And so the hypothesis was that if you were exposed to these concussive blasts, you were essentially getting a brain injury over time, and that this was causing the PTSD symptoms. The term PTSD didn't exist at the time. That was pretty quickly taken away as a hypothesis because there were soldiers who hadn't been exposed to these concussive blasts who had the same symptoms. And so it's interesting to me that we're sort of repeating the mistake and we're thinking that traumatic brain, okay, there is no such thing as PTSD. It's all traumatic brain injury. Well, okay, what about the people who don't have brain injury, physical brain injury, who have the symptoms? What does that mean about them? And unfortunately, often what the field of psychology will say that those people are making it up. And that is really dangerous. We don't want to go backwards. We don't want to go in that direction. Yes, we're talking about trauma more, but if we're not getting it right, we are going to go back to the early 1900s.
Well, there's so much great research being done and books like yours being written, thank goodness, that are propelling us forward. MC, where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community and learn more about your work?
Oh, yeah. Thank you. There's 3 places. So I'm on Instagram at mc.phd and also on TikTok, mc.phd. And my website is alchemycoaching.life.
Well, MC, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Oh, thank you. This was such a lovely conversation.
Well, it's been such a joy to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, Unbroken. On that note, we're going to pause here for a quick moment, and we'll be right back after these messages. I'd like to thank Jason Eastwood at Guitarfulness for sharing his inspiring music and talent with us. His music is known worldwide for cultivating atmospheres of harmony, inner peace, and clarity. Visit Jason's website at guitarfulness.com. Join his newsletter, be part of his community, and download his music. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary. A recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.